Hi, I'm Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about the endings of tabletop games. I have a theory, it's not a crazy theory, but just a theory, that the endings of games matter more than pretty much any other time in the game. Maybe arguably the beginning of the game when you're onboarding someone into the game for the first time, but I think endings really matter. I think about the movies you love, the TV shows that you love, the books that you love. Many of them end triumphantly. They end with a memorable climactic moment. And I think some of the best tabletop games do the same thing. So today I wanted to talk about 10 different ways that 10 of my favorite games end and how that might have an impact on the game as a whole. I'm going to give a lot of examples today, but I'm going to focus on 10 games in particular. So I asked Stonemaier ambassadors what they thought about this in terms of competitive and cooperative games. And the games that were mentioned more than once in the competitive category were Ark Nova, Betrayal, House on the Hill, Clank, Concordia, Dune Imperium, Heat, Power Grid, Scythe, Star Wars Rebellion, Terraforming Mars, Thunder Road Vendetta, Ticket to Ride, Twilight Imperium 4th Edition, Unmatched, and War of the Ring. Then in the cooperative category, these are the games that ambassadors mentioned more than once. Aeon's End, Arkham Horror LCG, Cthulhu Death May Die, Daybreak, Escape from Zombie City, Forbidden Island, Gloomhaven, Mansions of Madness, Marvel Champions, Marvel United, Mysterium, Nemesis, Pandemic, Return to Dark Tower, Sky Team, Sleeping Gods, Spirit Island, The Crew, The Loop, and The Night Cage. So those were the ambassador picks. Some of them will appear in my list as honorable mentions or as the top pick. But let's jump into these categories. And these are in no particular order. This is a top 10 list that is not numbered from 1 to 10. So the first category, I'll have this up on the other screen here. The first category are games where you are physically racing to the finish. So these are racing games where there is a spatial element where you're starting someplace and you're trying to finish at a different place or way back at the start. They're tangible, physical, spatial races to the finish. So a bunch of racing games could fit into this category. I list Ready, Set, Bet, Heat, and Downforce among these. But the number one game for me for this category that finishes particularly well is Camel Up. And you can see this over here on this other screen. I think Camel Up ends particularly well. And I think for the reason for that, so in Camel Up, you have these camels and you are not, you don't have any camels of your own. You have camels that you might be rooting for because you've bet on them in the short term or the long term, but I am not the red camel. I'm doing a couple different things on my turn to either manipulate the race or bet on camels that I think are doing well. It also has this wonderful element where if, like in this case, the yellow camel moved up onto the same space as the blue camel, and now when the blue camel moves, it's going to move the yellow camel with it. Because this is a game where players are rooting for or against multiple different camels, and you're just doing one lap of the track, there really is this triumphant moment at the end of the game where you don't know when the game will end because you don't know when a camel will cross the finish line. Sometimes camels even move backwards because there are white and black camels that move the opposite direction. So a camel that might be about to cross the finish line may not cross the finish line because of those white and black camels. The game doesn't fully end at that moment. There are reveals to happen. And several times in this list, I'm going to talk about moments that happen after the end game is triggered that still lead to triumphant finishes. And this is one of them because you are revealing who bet on which camels to win or lose the race, to finish first or finish last. And that is a reveal. You're going through these cards saying, okay, this player picked this one or they didn't pick this one. And they're gaining coins along the way if they guess correctly. So that reveal still leads to some triumphant moments after a camel has even finished the race. So yeah, for the category of a physical race to the finish, I put Camel Up as my top pick. The next category is a race to a certain number of points. There are a number of games that I really like in this category. I think this is just in general a category that I enjoy. Among them, I list Ark Nova, and Rogers of the Ganges have crossing paths. So you're actually accumulating two different types of points and trying to intersect those two types of points. Viticulture has a race to get to 25 points. You still get to finish that year in Viticulture. And then Space Base has a race to points as well. But I think the number one pick for me is Dune Imperium in terms of how it handles this race to points, both because there really aren't that many points in the game. You're trying to reach 10 points. So every point feels like it matters. And oftentimes in Dune Imperium, there are many times where you end up very, very close at the end of the game, where a player just needs one more point to trigger the end of the game, and they don't know if they're going to be able to do it or not. It might come down to combat. It might come down to one of these influence tracks where even if you reach the top of the track, another player can take that token away from you, can take that influence away from you. So you might be at 9, but another player might take that influence away from you and you drop down to 8. So there's a lot of tension that happens right at the end of the track. I think Dune Imperium also helps this escalation build the big moments due to the staggered conflict cards, in that there are multiple levels of conflict cards that that level up essentially in terms of how many points you can get from them. Like, I don't think that you can get any points from the level 1 card or cards. I think there's more than one. You can sometimes get points from level 2, and then in level 3 there are times where you can get 2 points. So the game gives you these big moments at the end of the game. It ramps up due to the conflict cards. But yeah, Dune Imperium, I think, is my favorite pick in this category of a race to get to a certain number of points. And then you could also go a little bit farther than that because you do finish the round. The next category, we're talking about points one more time. Maybe it'll come up later, but another points category, victory points category, are big bursts of points. So games where leading up to the end of the game, you are getting big bursts of points. So I talked about Dune Imperium being a game where you're getting maybe 2 points at the end of the game, maybe 3 if you really put some things together. But then there's a game like Tapestry, which is my top pick in this category. Games like Tapestry, Russian Railroads, where in your last round, you might be getting hundreds of points based on all the engine building you've been doing, all the income that you're gaining by that endpoint in the game. You are ramping up to a huge number of points, and that can lead to a big finish. Now, I should say for Tapestry, it is a game where players can finish at different times. So I can finish my game, and you might still have a few more turns. So that can take away from a triumphant finish. I will definitely say that about Tapestry. But I do think that there's something to be said about games that start with very few points and lead up to your finish, at least for the game, being a ton of points at the very end. So even though all players might not be finishing at the same time, your personal finish might be very satisfying in a game like Tapestry. So that's games where there's a big burst of points at the end of the game. The next category is a race to not lose or to finish building something. I've kind of combined two elements here where there is this tension in the game where you are either avoiding losing, you're trying really hard not to lose, or you have a timer, a limited amount of time to build something that you really want to build. And so if you can just barely finish building that thing, or just barely finish the race, whatever the race may be, it'll make more sense in a second, then it can feel really good. The ending can feel really good. So the examples here are Burgle Brothers, a cooperative game where you are trying to outwit some guards to perform a heist. All players need to get out of the whatever you're robbing, the bank in Burgle Brothers. And so there's that race to not lose. In Agricola, it's a race to finish something, because in Agricola, you rarely feel like you have enough time to do everything that you want to do. But if you can just barely fill your farm in the final turn, or the final 1 or 2 turns, that can be really satisfying. My top pick for this category is Clank, because Clank has several different race elements, but the main one is that you are racing down into this dungeon, trying to gather as many points as possible in the form of cards, in the form of artifacts, in the form of some mysterious tokens, and then you're trying to race out of the dungeon. You're ideally trying to race all the way out of the dungeon to get an extra 20 points. But once someone does that, it puts the timer on all other players to try to get out of this dungeon, at least above ground, so they can even score the game for their points at all before the end of the game. There's a timer related to a dragon that ticks down rather quickly after someone gets out of the dungeon. So that there's a lot of tension in this race to get out. So, and this is actually another game similar to Tapestry, where your game, the green player's game in this case, might finish before other players, and they're then just watching the other players for a few minutes. But the other players' turns typically only take a few minutes after that, because the timer is actively ticking down on them. leading to a personal, satisfying, triumphant victory or loss for individual players, but also still it's entertaining for the player whose game is already over and they're safe as they watch other players scramble to try to get above ground or even out of the dungeon. So that is a race to not lose or to finish building something by the end of the game with Clank as my top pick. A recent play of mine, I played First in Flight recently, and this is in the category of one final chance to use what you have. So First in Flight and Project L do this. So these are games where you've built something during the game that leads to you doing a certain type of turn. And First in Flight is a flight turn. In Project L, you are gathering tokens that you're trying to use to fill in these polyomino tiles. And both of these games, when the end game is triggered, they give players the chance to do the thing that they've been trying to do the whole game one more time. So maybe they haven't had the chance. Maybe you haven't had a chance in First in Flight to go on one last flight. Maybe in Project L, you've built up all these tokens, but you didn't have the turn that you needed to actually fill them in on your tiles. I like when games give you one last chance to do this. It lets you end the game feeling very satisfied rather than feeling like you missed out on an opportunity. My pick of these two is First in Flight, in that you were trying to go on one final flight. You're running through the deck building portion of the game where you're trying to reveal as these numbers on these cards without crashing so that you get up to 40 or beyond, which is it's a flight of 40 yards or beyond, yards or meters. So I can't remember which one. So I really like the game does this. I really like even though the game does give you chances to fly throughout the game, that is an important part of the game, to go on these flights throughout the game, to test out your plane, to get rid of defects. But I really like that when the game ends, it gives you one last chance. All players get to go on one final flight at the end of the game. So yeah, First in Flight is my top pick in the category of one final chance to use what you have. The next category is a surprise reveal at the end of the game. A couple different games that do this. So Bag of Chips is one that I really debated between Bag of Chips and Lords of Waterdeep, which I picked as my top pick. But in Bag of Chips, there's this wonderful tension that happens at the end of the game where you reveal the chips one by one at the end of the game to see if players have met their goals. Argent, the Consortium, has a bunch of end game goals that are revealed as a surprise at the end. Villainous often ends in a surprise where you reveal that you have actually met your asymmetric goal in Villainous. But for me, for general reasons and thanks to the end game reveal, I think Lords of Waterdeep is my top pick, because Lords of Waterdeep, each player has a hidden lord that they are trying to. In fact, I can't remember Lords of Waterdeep if you are the lord or if you are trying to appeal to this lord. I think you are the lord in Lords of Waterdeep, where you have something that's important to you, whether it's a certain type of quest card, you're trying to build a number of buildings. And so it's something that you've been working on the entire game as this secret lord. It's a little bit of a mischievous element. And then at the end of the game, you are revealing, hey, I've been this lord all along. I have been accumulating all these quests. I get this big chunk of points because of all this work that I've done during the game. So it's this reveal that isn't always that much of a surprise in Lords of Waterdeep, but it is something important to reveal at the end of the game that I think can lead to a triumphant finish. So that's kind of a surprise reveal at the end of the game with Lords of Waterdeep as my example. I have two examples in this category of what I'm calling cinematic automation and even storytelling. So the two examples here are Rumble Nation and Let's Go to Japan. And I'm going to talk about both of them briefly. I'm showing Let's Go to Japan here, which was very barely my pick over Rumble Nation. But these are both games where you are essentially accounting for points with all players paying attention to it. It's a little hard to describe because it's not like most games where you are scoring points at the end of the game. Rather, you are doing something cinematic and something important to the game, thematically important to the game, while you're scoring those points. So in Rumble Nation, you are placing units throughout most of the game. You're placing units on this board. And then at the end of the game, the last third of the game, I was going to say second half, but it's really the last third of the game, you are automatically going through what you've already done. So you're no longer making decisions. Instead, you are going through the territories one by one and showing who won the battle and assigning points based on who won the battle or who got second place. And then you move on to the next battle. And the earlier battles often impact the later battles. So there's an element of automation. You're essentially just scoring points at this time, but it is cinematic. You're watching this all your plans unfold in real time as you play. Let's Go to Japan also does this, and I'm giving it a slight edge because I think it is actually, these are both Japan-themed games, but Let's Go to Japan, I think, is the theme of it, the storytelling element of it is so good. In Let's Go to Japan, you're spending the first half of the game planning a trip to Japan, a 6-day trip to Japan by placing these cards, deciding what your highlight of the day is and what the things are you're doing earlier in the day and where you're doing them in Tokyo versus Kyoto. And then at the end of the game, one by one, players will talk about their Monday. You'll say, okay, this is what I did on Monday, step by step. And you'll get some points for it. You'll get some resources for it. And you will kind of tell your story. You're literally saying, okay, I went to the Heian Shrine, and then I went to Kokodera Temple, and then I went to a geisha show at the Gion Corner. And when I did that show, I stayed for a Bunraku show. So they even add thematic text here based on whether or not I've accumulated these resources. And if I had, I scored these things at the end of the game. So you're going through this day by day. I'm doing my Monday, then you're doing your Monday. So we're telling this story, scoring points on an ongoing basis as we talk about our week in Japan. I think this is a wonderful way to score points at the end of the game in a way that feels cinematic and thematic without it just being an accounting at the end of the game. So that is cinematic automation and storytelling with Let's Go to Japan, just barely edging out Rumble Nation. Let's stay on theme a little bit here and talk about thematic end game conditions. So I have a kind of a wide range of games with various themes here. So some games that fit into this category, games like Nemesis, Betrayal, House on the Hill, Star Wars Rebellion, Arkham Horror LCG. I actually picked Blob Party for it, which I know isn't typically seen as thematic as these other games that have this thematic slash cinematic finish. But Blob Party is a cooperative game where you are literally trying to blob together with other players. So the theme is that you're putting your blobs together. You're trying to write down the same things as other players. And as you blob together, you're choosing your group of blob. Your blob is choosing one word or one thing that you wrote down to present to all other players. And the ending is that you physically put all your Play-Doh together with your little googly eyes on it. Definitely not the same level of theme as Nemesis, Star Wars Rebellion, those types of games. But it is a really thematic conclusion to a game. You are literally blobbing together. You've been working towards this the entire game, and you finally blob together at the end of the game if you manage to write down the same thing as the other players of the other blob. So Blob Party is my pick for thematic endgame conditions. If I had to pick a more cinematic thematic endgame condition, I'd probably go with Star Wars Rebellion, which ends with either the Empire finding and destroying the Rebel base, or the rebels, I think, just simply outlasting the Empire. All right, so that is, thematic endgame conditions. Number 9 here, or the 9th one I'm talking about, are ending with a boss fight. This is a great way to go, especially if you have a game where you are fighting lots of different units or going through a number of trials. If you end with a boss fight, that can feel memorable. That can feel triumphant, especially if you succeed in defeating the boss. Some games that do this are The Witcher Old World, Black Orchestra, Marvel Legendary, and Slay the Spire is my pick for this. You can see the Slay the Spire, where you're doing a lot of things along the way that are important to the game. These are meaningful to the game. And I think that's key for games that end well, that it isn't just the end that matters. The journey does matter. But when you get to the end, it is a big fight. It is distinctly different and bigger than what you've done in the past for the previous round, and you've built up to that moment where you're fighting the boss. Slay the Spire is a game where you actually fight through multiple bosses, but I have played Slay the Spire where we've only played one act and just fought one boss, and it felt like a complete game to me. It still felt very satisfying to end the game in that way, to end the game with a big boss fight. I think this is a good way to go. It doesn't always literally have to be a fight against a boss, but building up to a big moment, a big preset moment like that, like a boss fight, I think is a great way to end the game triumphantly. Win or lose against that boss. And last, speaking of winning or losing, we have the category of winning or losing by the slimmest of margins. So games that really do come down to the wire at the very end, where you could lose, you could win. This works for cooperative and competitive games. There's Cthulhu Death May Die, Sky Team, Pandemic, War of the Ring. All these games, you feel like you have a chance to win if you do the right thing, if you get a little bit lucky at the end of the game. My top pick of this category is Marvel Dice Throne. So in Marvel Dice Throne, or Dice Throne in general, I prefer the Marvel version. There is the chance that you will roll exactly what you need to roll at the end of the game to just barely finish off your opponent, or that they won't roll what they need to do. So even if they have a big advantage, that maybe they won't roll what they needed to finish you off, or you might have a great defensive roll and you might stall just long enough to finish them off. You always feel like you have a chance in Marvel Dice Throne, or in Dice Throne in general. In this dice rolling game, it has a Yahtzee mechanism where you're trying to ideally set off your ultimate ability, which deals the most damage. Doesn't win you the game, but it does deal the most damage to your opponent. But yeah, I love this idea of winning or losing by slim margins. Whether it is a dueling game, a two-player dueling game, a cooperative game, or a competitive game, games that come down to the wire, this moment where you win or lose at the very end, I think can have a nice big impact on how a game ends. So that is my 10th category. I do want to mention there are two videos that I linked to in the description below. One is a video that I filmed years ago called 10 Ways to End a Game. So I talked about different ways to trigger the end of the game. Doesn't necessarily always lead to triumphant endgame conditions like I talked about today. And then very recently, just coincidentally, Cogito Design had a video about victory points and their impact on the end of the game, which is something obviously I talked about today, that victory points, you can have a triumphant end of the game even with victory points in play. I think sometimes there's an element of the accounting of victory points at the end of the game that can sometimes lead to a less triumphant finish. But I think there are ways, as I demonstrated today, that if you're scoring more on an ongoing basis, that can be really satisfying, a satisfying way to end the game with a big chunk of victory points. Or if you have a thematic storytelling through victory points, or if you have a race to get to a certain number of points, like in Dune Imperium, there are ways to have victory points in games and still lead to triumphant endings. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What's your favorite game that I mentioned today? And what is a game that you maybe played recently where it had a truly triumphant, memorable ending that you really enjoyed? Let me know about that in the comments below. Thanks.